Hello, I am Winston Churchill, and I would like to share my story with you. I was born at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire on November 30, 1874. My father, Randolph Churchill, was a member of Parliament for Woodstock, and my mother, Jenny Churchill, was an American. Despite their wealth and connections, my parents were often in debt and had money troubles, which would later become a common issue in my own life. In 1876, my family moved to Ireland when my grandfather was appointed viceroy. 3 years later, my brother Jack was born, which sparked rumors regarding his paternity due to my parents' distant relationship. My relationship with my parents was also distant, as was common in the English aristocracy at the time. I was raised by my nanny, whom I affectionately called Woomany. At the age of 7, I was sent to St. George's boarding school in Ascot, where I gained a reputation as an unruly pupil and struggled academically. After some health issues, I was moved to the Brunswick School near Hove. Meanwhile, my father, Randolph, was a prominent politician, having served as Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1886. However, Randolph's outspokenness often put him at odds with his fellow cabinet members, particularly in his attempts to cut public expenditure, especially in the military. After only 4 months as Chancellor, he resigned, thinking that he was too valuable for the Conservative government to lose. Unfortunately, his gamble failed, and he was effectively finished politically. My school performance improved, and I barely passed my exams in 1888. I then attended Harrow, where my father was determined that I pursue a military career. After failing to gain entry to the Royal Military College in Sandhurst twice, I was finally accepted on my 3rd attempt. I graduated as a cadet after a year of training. However, my pride was short-lived when my father died of syphilis in January 1895. The cause of his death was kept from me for some time. The following month, I was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant in the 4th Hazards Cavalry Regiment of the British Army. Later that year, I fought on the side of the Spanish Army against Cuban nationalists in their war for independence. This led to my first of many visits to the United States, where I spent time in New York and other cities, solidifying my affection and admiration for my mother's homeland. Upon my return from North America, I was sent to India in October of 1896. It was a year later, in 1897, with the support of my mother, that I managed to join the Malacan Field Force as a correspondent. It was during this time that I witnessed combat against the Mormons rebels and reported on it in the British Daily Telegraph. Once I had left India, I wrote a book detailing my experiences. It gained positive reviews, and with my newfound notoriety, I managed to gain a place on Herbert Kitchener's expedition to the Sudan. The aim of this expedition was to take on Abdullah bin Muhammad, who had established an Islamic caliphate in the country. He had previously been one of the right-hand men of Muhammad Ahmed, the self-proclaimed Mahdi. According to Islamic prophecy, the Mahdi was supposed to rid the world of evil and, along with Jesus, defeat the false Messiah, or Antichrist. The Mahdi had started his Islamic uprising in the Sudan in 1881 and initially led a successful campaign in the region, even defeating a British-led Egyptian army at the Battle of Shishikan in November 1883. This prompted the British Liberal government, who deemed the country not to be worth fighting for, to send Major General Charles Gordon to the Sudanese capital of Khartoum to evacuate Egyptian civilian personnel. But Gordon, on arrival, decided to fortify the city as the Mahdi's army had cut off river traffic on the River Nile to the north, making an evacuation impossible. Khartoum then fell to the Mahdi in January of 1885 after a 10-month siege. Gordon, who was by this time a hero in Britain, was killed in the fighting and beheaded. However, the Mahdi himself also died soon afterwards of typhus and was replaced by Abdullah ibn Muhammad, who ruled over the Sudan until 1896. The British, fearing a French invasion of the country, sent the previously mentioned invasion force to defeat the Islamists once and for all. Kitchener's army then journeyed down the Nile and defeated Abim Muhammad's forces at the Battle of Omdurman. A few days after the battle, I was involved in a cavalry charge against the remnants of Muhammad's forces. Following this experience, I wrote my account of the conflict entitled The River War, in which I criticized Kitchener's handling of the campaign. I would eventually become a prolific writer during my lifetime, publishing over 24 books, with each often consisting of several volumes. After returning home, I sailed to South Africa to take part in the Boer War. Unfortunately, I was involved in several engagements and was captured when the troop train I was traveling on was derailed during an ambush. I was then sent to a prisoner of war camp near Pretoria. However, I managed to escape by climbing over the perimeter fence surrounding the camp. After being sheltered by sympathetic locales, I succeeded in sneaking aboard a freight train heading to neutral Portuguese East Africa. My escapades during this period attracted a great deal of public attention as well as praise in the British press. The Boers had started a large-scale manhunt for me, and my successful escape was seen as a propaganda victory. Instead of sailing home and reaping the benefits of my newly found acclaim, I sailed to Durban and was appointed as a lieutenant in the South African Light Horse, before joining Redvers Buller's attempt to relieve the siege of the small town of Ladysmith in the natal region of South Africa. The town had been under siege by a force of some 20,000 Boer for over 3 months, and supplies were getting scarce, with the troops being forced to survive on horses and oxen meat. Finally, after repeated attempts to break the Boer stranglehold, Buller's force broke through the enemy lines and Ladysmith was relieved, with me being amongst the first troops to enter the town. I then arrived back in England 6 months later and sought to use the fame and notoriety I had earned on my travels to help me emulate my father Randolph by embarking on a career in politics. I stood for office as the Conservative candidate in the constituency of Oldham, Greater Manchester in 1900, winning by a slender margin, and afterwards embarked on a speaking tour of Britain and the United States in which I gave lectures on my experiences in the Boer War. I then, after returning home, threw myself into politics with the same vigor or rashness as I had exercised in my military career by making controversial speeches over the next 2 years in which I attacked the Conservative government of which I was a member. In these speeches, I continually criticized the Prime Minister, Arthur Balfour, and his cabinet for their policies on free trade restrictions and excessive military expenditure, and over the coming years continually voted against my own party, which inevitably resulted in me forming close political ties with the opposition Liberals. This disobedience eventually culminated in me crossing the floor and joining the Liberal Party in 1904, which resulted in my deselection as a Member of Parliament for Oldham. But this gamble eventually paid off a little over a year later when the Liberals came to power in 1906, and I was elected to be a Member of Parliament for Manchester North West instead. I was then given the position of Under Secretary of State for the Commonwealth Office and worked to ease the continuing tensions in South Africa between British immigrants, the Boers, and the native population. I then embarked on a European and African holiday in 1906, in which I progressed across France and Germany, at one point meeting Kaiser Wilhelm before traveling through Italy and onto Africa and Kenya, where I went game hunting. In 1908, I, who was now president of the Board of Trade, lost my seat in Manchester and was instead given a safer seat at Dundee in Scotland, after which I played an important role in the instigation of labour exchanges and unemployment insurance, which, after a fierce struggle, were proved in 1910, along with a myriad of other progressive liberal reforms, such as the Old Age Pensions Act of 1908. Indeed, it is fair to say that my political views were complex in the extreme, as I supported trade unions and welfare programs early in my political career, but later, on the other hand, argued for the preservation of Britain's empire. In short, I was a complex character politically, as I evidently had some socialist, liberal, and conservative views, which can perhaps explain my changing allegiances during my career in Parliament. In 1908, I tied the knot with a charming lass by the name of Clementine Hosier, who turned out to be the wind beneath my wings, aiding me in all my endeavours. Without her, it's quite possible that I would not have scaled the heights of success in my career or managed to weather the storm of my recurring depression, which I referred to as my black dog. In 1910, I was appointed as the Home Secretary, a post that caused quite a stir on account of my stance on various issues, such as the Cambrian colliery dispute, my opposition to the suffragette movement, and the infamous Sydney Street siege, wherein 2 Latvian revolutionaries were cornered out, committing a spate of robberies and murders in Greater London. During the siege, I took personal control of the situation, drawing significant flack from the press. A year later, in 1911, I was entrusted with the responsibility of overseeing the Royal Navy as the First Lord of the Admiralty, an appointment that was a massive feather in my cap. During this time, Britain's naval dominance was under threat, with several nations across the globe actively building powerful warships. The years leading up to World War, I had witnessed a naval arms race between Britain and Germany, and I was tasked with constructing a slew of battleships, including the Queen Elizabeth class, which were the fastest and most potent vessels ever launched by the Royal Navy. As soon as the Great War broke out and trench warfare reached a stalemate on the Western Front, we decided to attempt to remove Germany's ally, Turkey, from the equation by seizing control of the land surrounding the Dardanelles. The Dardanelles, which controlled the western approaches from the Mediterranean Sea to the Turkish capital of Constantinople and the Black Sea beyond, was to be captured by a joint British and French naval task force. Alas, our efforts ended in tragedy as we failed to achieve our objectives due to the tenacity of Turkish resistance. The result was a 10-month-long battle of attrition that ended with the humiliating withdrawal of Allied forces, leaving behind some 300,000 dead or wounded soldiers. As the First Lord of the Admiralty and one of the primary advocates of the operation, I was blamed for the campaign's failure and the staggering loss of life. The demotion that followed was a severe blow, and the campaign, now known as the Gallipoli Campaign, would have spelled the end of the road for lesser mortals. To redeem myself, I volunteered to join the army, and in early 1916, I was posted to the Western Front as a major with the Grenadier Guards, later becoming a lieutenant colonel with the Royal Scots Fusiliers. I saw combat on numerous occasions and was highly respected by the troops under my command, but some, including Prime Minister Lloyd George, questioned my motivations, and this doubt would remain in the minds of my detractors for years to come. In the spring of 1916, I returned to Parliament, and for the rest of the war, I held significant positions within the coalition government, such as Minister for Munitions, Secretary of State for War, and Secretary of State for Air. An intriguing fact about me is that I played a vital role in developing the tank, which proved pivotal in breaking the deadlock on the Western Front in the latter stages of the conflict. I must say, I played an important role in securing victory in both world wars. After the armistice of 1918, whilst at the War Office, I had a hand in the failed attempt to intervene in the Russian Civil War against the Bolsheviks. Later, after being appointed Secretary of State for the colonies in 121, I was also involved in the instigation of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which made Southern Ireland an independent nation and started the gradual disintegration of the British Empire. However, in the 1922 election, I lost my seat in Dundee, largely due to me recovering from an appendix removal. After that, I drifted away from the Liberals, but became a vocal critic of the new Labour government. By the early 20s, I had begun to once again associate myself with the Conservative Party, and after winning a seat in Parliament for the constituency of Epping, I was appointed by the new Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, to the post of Chancellor of the Exchequer in 1924, which prompted me to then rejoin the Conservatives. However, my tenure as Chancellor was not that much more successful than my late father's, largely due to my disastrous policy of bringing Britain back into the gold standard. This was a form of account that fixed the price of money to that of the gold supply, and I later admitted this was a mistake, as deflation of the pound ensued and public spending was limited to the gold supply. This meant that in the coming Great Depression, the government had restricted cash flow with which to stop the banks from collapsing and stimulate the economy. It should be noted also that I was a deeply unpopular figure in many ordinary people's eyes at this time, as they saw me as a warmonger, career politician and political turncoat whose decision to rejoin the gold standard had consigned an entire generation into abject poverty. The Conservatives were then soundly defeated in the general election of 1929, which resulted in me being sidelined within the party, largely due to my unpopular opposition to Indian Home Rule, my actions regarding the gold standard, and my seemingly ever-changing allegiances. This, in turn, led to my decade-long wilderness years, in which I retreated from politics and focused on writing and my painting, which I in large part undertook to ease my sense of failure and depression. This culminated in me writing a 3-volume biography of my ancestor, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, who had defeated the armies of Louis Axis of France during various battles, such as Blenheim during the War of the Spanish Succession in the early 18th century. Indeed, I was a great expert on Marlborough, and there is a body of opinion that states my excellent grasp of history enabled me to see the parallels between Louis Axis and Adolf Hitler, both of whom sought to dominate Europe and persecute religious minorities. By this time, in the early 1930s, Hitler was Chancellor of Germany and was rearming the country at breakneck speed, which prompted me to make speeches and write articles warning of the possible threat that Nazi Germany posed. I was aided in this by Ralph Weigram, an official in the Foreign Office, who, along with many other contacts, had been passing intelligence on Germany's rearmament to me, which gave my speeches and columns a lot more weight. This, in turn, forced Stanley Baldwin's government, who returned to power in 1935, to take notice. However, I was still largely ignored in Britain, as many people throughout the country and world didn't want to contemplate the possibility of another European conflict. But these people were soon shaken out of their complacency, as by the late 1930s, it all became too evident that Hitler was intent on aggressive expansion. As the lilyhood of war increased, I was steadily accepted back into the mainstream of British politics. 2 days after World War II broke out in September 1939, I was reappointed as First Lord of the Admiralty. But again, concerns over my judgment were raised after my plans to stop German iron ore shipments from Norway by raiding the port of Narvik in April of 1940 resulted in failure after Hitler invaded the country. Despite this operation being of my design, and it having worrying similarities with the Gallipoli disaster, Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, who had consistently tried and failed to prevent an outbreak of war, was forced to resign after the Labour Party made it clear it would not foment a coalition government under his leadership. The choice of replacement was now between me and Lord Halifax, who did not want the position. Therefore, Chamberlain then, on the evening of the 10 May 1940, made the short journey from 10 Downing Street to Buckingham Palace to tender his resignation, after which he recommended that King George VI should invite me to form a government. I was now the Prime Minister of Great Britain. However, I had ascended to the post in the midst of the most critical and dangerous crisis since the First World War, and the fate of the country was now firmly on my shoulders. I was then thrown right into the deep end from day one of my premiership, as the very same day I became Prime Minister, Germany invaded Holland, Belgium and France, resulting in the military disaster that was the fall of Western Europe. I spent these desperate weeks travelling to and from the continent in the hope of keeping the French in the fight. But as its armies had all but collapsed in the face of the German advance, I, along with my commanders, resolved to commit no more resources to the defence of Britain's ally, and instead decided to evacuate the British Expeditionary Force from France before it was annihilated by Hitler's panzers and the Luftwaffe. This resulted, with the aid of civilian craft as well as the Royal Navy, in over 300,000 Allied troops being rescued from Dunkirk, meaning that Britain still had an army capable of putting up a fight in the event of a German invasion, and later resisting the Italian and German incursions into North Africa. I now set about silencing the voices within my own government, particularly Lord Halifax, who were arguing for peace negotiations to begin with Hitler. After doing so, I began the mammoth task of reorganizing the country's defenses for the inevitable onslaught. After the surrender of France, the north of the country fell into Hitler's clutches, while the south remained under the control of Philippe Pétain, with its capital situated in the French city of Vichy. However, despite France being dismembered, the country still boasted an empire and a formidable war fleet based in the North African colony of Algeria. Nevertheless, with Vichy France effectively under German control, I made the decision that Britain could not afford to let the French fleet fall into German hands. Consequently, I ordered a naval task force to set sail into the Mediterranean to neutralize the threat. On 3 July 1940, the British fleet arrived off the coast of Algeria and demanded the French hand over their battleships. However, they refused, and we had no choice but to open fire on our former allies. One of the French battleships was sunk, 2 others were damaged, and 1,300 sailors lost their lives. While this was seen as treachery in France, it was necessary from our perspective to ensure Britain's naval supremacy in the Mediterranean. Hitler's plan to invade Britain commenced in July 1940 with mass air attacks on ground targets and radar installations across southern England. These attacks were designed to cripple our country's air defences and pave the way for a cross-channel invasion. However, Britain was well prepared for the German Luftwaffe. We had pioneered the world's first air defence network, known today as the Dowding system, after the head of RAF Fighter Command, Hugh Dowding. This system involved radar stations along England's south coast linked via landlines to Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory in northwest London. Along with the Royal Observer Corps, it enabled us to build a live strategic overview of all inbound enemy air activity and send the required number of fighters to intercept them. The Hawker Hurricane and Supermarine Spitfire played a significant role, but the Dowding system was the real hero of the Battle of Britain. Without it, the RAF would have only been able to defend the country's skies via random patrol. Over the following months, the RAF and the Luftwaffe engaged in aerial combat above the skies of Britain, with massive losses on both sides. By the end of the summer, the RAF was on its knees. However, on 25 August 1940, RAF bombers dropped their payloads on residential areas in Berlin, hampered by heavy cloud cover. This prompted Hitler to undertake reprisal bombing raids across London in what we know today as the Blitz. This change in strategy effectively saved Britain from possible invasion, as the Luftwaffe now concentrated its efforts on bombing London instead of destroying the RAF. The RAF quickly regrouped and strengthened its numbers of pilots and aircraft over the coming months. During the Battle of Britain and the Blitz on London, I rallied the populace with some of the most famous speeches ever broadcast. These helped the British people realize the gravity of the threat we faced and strengthened their resolve to carry on the fight. Indeed, my rallying of the British population was particularly crucial during these dark times, as our country stood alone against Nazi Germany and faced the threat of Imperial Japan's military expansion. The situation was dire, especially as our navy was scattered throughout the world. To make matters worse, the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini believed we were too weak to oppose him and ordered the invasion of British-controlled Egypt in September 1940 via Italian Libya. Thankfully, we were able to quickly crush this invasion through our counterattacks, pushing the Italians back towards Tunisia. However, this prompted Hitler to send General Erwin Rommel and the Afrika Korps to intervene, fearing that a British victory would secure our dominance of the Mediterranean. One of the few options left for Britain was to seek the assistance of the United States, and as someone who was half American on my mother's side, I had long enjoyed good relations within the country and in particular with its president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. We both shared a love of the Navy and had been exchanging correspondence and gifts for some years, with me even giving Roosevelt a signed copy of my biography of the Duke of Marlborough during the 1930s. This relationship proved crucial in securing the eventual victory over the Axis powers, as we simply could not hope to defeat Germany, Japan, and Italy alone. We desperately needed assistance and supplies, despite the understandable hatred many within the United States, particularly those of Irish descent, had for the British. Roosevelt eventually secured enough support to assist us through the system of aid known today as Lend-Lease. This involved the United States supplying Britain, Free France, China, and later the Soviet Union with food and war materials in return for gold, money, and access to naval bases throughout the globe. Lend-Lease was crucial in keeping Britain, which was by now a shrinking world power, in the conflict. Without it, we would have almost certainly had to secure peace terms with the Axis powers in 1940. I am proud to say that I was instrumental in securing the backing of the United States and Roosevelt for this program, as it was arguably one of my most important achievements. Without it, defeat would have been almost certain. The battle for North Africa was in full swing by this stage, with a low point coming when the Germans captured Tobruk in 1942 and threatened to overrun Egypt. As the Suez Canal was vital for the flow of supplies between Europe and our empire, not to mention the massive oil reserves in the Middle East beyond it, losing control of it would have been disastrous. During this time, I also gave the go-ahead for the formation of the world's first Special Forces units, namely the Commandos and the Special Air Service SAS. These consisted of volunteers who were given intensive extra training and better weaponry than regular troops. The Commandos were involved in various raids on the continent during World War II, including the brilliant raid on Saint-Nazaire, in which the only docks in France capable of holding the massive German battleship Tirpitz were destroyed. The SARS, on the other hand, were formed in North Africa and conducted brilliant raids behind enemy lines in the desert, destroying hundreds of German aircraft and various installations, severely damaging their fighting capability. I must say, Certain generals were dead set against deploying special forces at the time, but I overruled them. I knew their potential to wreak havoc behind enemy lines was crucial to our war effort. Later on, I championed the use of civilian resistance groups in mainland Europe, who were often directed and supplied by Britain's Special Operations Executive, or SOE. This daring group carried out thousands of raids across occupied Europe during World War II. The largest threat Germany posed to us after 1940 was undoubtedly its U-boat fleet. I considered it top priority to deal with this menace. However, the British eventually gained the upper hand in the battle for the Atlantic with the help of our codebreakers at Bletchley Park, including the brilliant Alan Turing. Turing cracked the German Enigma codes, and combined with the ever-increasing flow of war materials from America, we steadily overwhelmed the limited numbers of German U-boats. Hitler had embarked on his massive invasion of the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, which quickly became the main focus of his attention. It became clear to both him and the German High Command that subdued Stalin's Russia was not the easy task they had first thought. By this stage, I was regularly undertaking long and dangerous journeys to and from North Africa, the United States and Britain, involving hundreds of thousands of air miles. The stress and workload had taken a serious toll on my health. However, the attack by Imperial Japan on the US naval base at Pearl Harbor on 7 December 1941, followed by Hitler declaring war on the United States 4 days later, was perhaps the best news of the war from a British perspective. The war was effectively decided as soon as Hitler declared war on America, as Germany could not hope to outproduce both the United States, Britain, and Russia in terms of food, supplies, or manpower. The outcome of World War I was effectively decided as early as the winter of 1941. This was borne out over the coming years, as from 1942 onwards, the Axis powers' lack of resources, combined with their increasingly overstretched industry, resulted in a long process of retreat and defeat for them, culminating in the effective collapse of German resistance in Russia. The war was effectively decided as soon as Hitler declared war on America, as Germany could not hope to outproduce both the United States, Britain, and Russia in terms of food, supplies, or manpower. The outcome of World War II was effectively decided as early as the winter of 1941. This was borne out over the coming years, as from 1942 onwards, the Axis powers' lack of resources, combined with their increasingly overstretched industry, resulted in a long process of retreat and defeat for them, culminating in the effective collapse of German resistance in Russia. From 1943 onwards, their defeat in North Africa and the subsequent invasion of Italy, along with the gradual liberation of all the Japanese territorial gains in the Pacific, meant that I had effectively succeeded in my goal. Britain was now the minor partner in the Triple Alliance between it, the United States, and the Soviet Union, and the remainder of the conflict would increasingly see both me and Britain taking a back seat in all theatres. However, without me keeping Britain in the conflict, it is almost certain that the invasion of Italy and the later D-Day landings would never have taken place, meaning that Stalin's Russia would have had to deal with Hitler's invasion alone and very possibly collapsed as a result. Despite my successes, I have faced criticism in recent years for my involvement, or lack thereof, in trying to alleviate the Bengal famine of 1943. This tragedy came about after the Japanese occupied Burma and cut off rice imports to the eastern subcontinent in 1942. I and my war cabinet were in fear of a Japanese invasion of India during World War II, and thus we ordered a scorched earth policy in the region. Thousands of acres of farmland were seized or destroyed, which, coupled with a series of natural disasters, including a cyclone in the Bay of Bengal, exacerbated the already widespread starvation famine. Sadly, upwards of 3 million people died in the region, with some even claiming the figure to be much higher. Indian and progressive historians have largely blamed me for perpetuating and even instigating this famine, as my disregard for the country and its freedom-seeking populace was no secret. Some even went so far as to compare me with Hitler, labeling me a racist mass murderer. However, my defenders argued that my war cabinet and I diverted 250,000 tons of grain to India when we became fully aware of the scale of the famine on September 24, 1943. The lack of shipping due to the war, poor local government, misplaced food allocations, and natural disasters also played a significant role in the crisis. My relationship with President Roosevelt was cordial, if not friendly, but my relationship with Stalin was fiery and interspersed with heated arguments. We first met a year after the Nazi invasion of Russia had started, when I made the dangerous journey via the Middle East to Moscow in August of 1942. The two of us held several alcohol-fueled meetings, and I felt the pressure from the Man of Steel to start a second front in Europe to relieve the pressure on the Russians. However, without American help, Britain simply did not have the manpower to undertake an amphibious landing on the continent. I had championed an invasion of Italy to start a second front, but the Americans were in favor of taking the most direct route through France. It has to be said that choosing France as the main focus of attack by the Western Allies was the correct one, given the hilly terrain of Italy, which naturally favored defense. The invasion of Italy proved to be a slow and bloody conflict that did little more than tie down several German armies. One of the primary ways the British had been able to carry the war to the Germans had been air raids, and by the later stages of the war, the RAF had accumulated a massive force of bombers, mainly consisting of the famous Lancaster. Earlier in the war, due to large losses over Germany, the British decided to conduct night bombings, which was safer for bomber crews, but resulted in less accuracy. The Americans, after entering the war, mounted large Kale daylight raids. After the Blitz, it became British policy to target German cities and industrial centers to wear down Hitler's supply chain. With ever-increasing air supremacy, it wasn't long before many German cities were reduced to rubble. Perhaps the greatest example of this was in the bombing of Dresden in February of 1945, in which over 20,000 people were killed. After the war, both the head of the RAF Bomber Command, Arthur Harris, and I were blamed for the deliberate bombings of civilian targets, as many people maintained it was a war crime. After our victory in 1945, I was voted out of office as Prime Minister, being replaced by the Labour Prime Minister Clement Attlee. However, I refused to be bitter about the defeat, despite leading my country to victory, stating that the British people had had a hard time. In the following years, I argued for the creation of the early European Union, or the United States of Europe, as I called it, thinking it essential in preventing future conflict, and regularly gave speeches warning of the threat of the Soviet Union. I then continued as leader of the opposition during the post-war period until the general election 1951, when I once again became Prime Minister. I was the first Prime Minister of Queen Elizabeth II's reign and proved to be a guiding influence for her in the early years of being monarch. However, my second tenure as Premier was largely dominated by struggling to deal with Britain's reducing role in the world and its withdrawal from empire, which was largely due to the country's near-exhausted and massively indebted economy. By this stage in my life, I had suffered numerous heart attacks and strokes, an early example of which occurred as early as 1941, when I had a heart attack while visiting President Roosevelt at the White House, and I also suffered another 2 years later after a bout of pneumonia. In many ways, it is remarkable that I lived to the age I did, as by modern standards, I was an alcoholic and was rarely to be seen without a drink or one of my famous Cuban cigars. My second spell as Prime Minister was then cut short when I suffered a severe and partially paralyzing stroke on the evening of the 23 June 1953, which left me bedridden for the next 6 months, after which I returned to my duties. However, it was clear that I was now unable to undertake the role of Prime Minister, and I finally resigned on the 5 April 1955, handing the reins of government to my deputy, Anthony Eden. Now in retirement, I spent much of my time in my home at Chartwell in Kent with my wife, Clementine, who had been with me through thick and thin since 1908, spending my time painting, writing, and relaxing abroad, loving the south of France in particular. My health continued to fail me, however, and on the morning of the 24th January 1965, after suffering another severe stroke, I passed away. Britain and the entire Western world was left grieving at my death, and there was a widespread feeling that with my passing, an era had come to a close. I was then given the great honour of a state funeral, before which my lead-lined coffin was taken up the Thames by boat, passing the London docks, where cranes were lowered in my honour before being taken to spalls through the streets, lined with tens of thousands of grieving people. I was then taken by train to Woodstock and laid to rest in the Churchill family cemetery at the church of St. Martin's in the village of Bladen, less than a few miles from my birthplace at Blenheim Palace. I am today widely regarded as one of Britain's greatest prime ministers, despite my faults and mistakes, both personal and professional. There is no doubt that without my resolve, bravery and fortitude, victory over the Axis powers and Hitler's Germany in particular would have been next to impossible. My key contributions to the Allied war effort was keeping Britain in the war, which ultimately enabled D-Day to happen. And there is also a body of opinion which states that without Britain's Arctic convoys to the Soviet Union from 1941 onwards, Stalin's Russia may have also collapsed under the German onslaught. Some claim that I was a warmonger and placed my own personal ambitions above the needs of my country, whilst others state that in India I am responsible for war crimes, particularly in the Bengal famine. To the majority of people, however, particularly in the West, I remain a hero, as without my insistence in continuing the fight against Hitler's Germany, Western Europe, Russia, and possibly the entire world would have fallen to Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan.